Sometimes a small dispute crosses borders and morphs into something way bigger than anyone ever expected. Take the current situation between the United States and Canada. What began as a clash over trade and tariffs is now shaking up energy markets on a global scale. Some have even gone so far as to joke, is Canada turning into America's 51st state? That statement might sound over the top, but it speaks to how deep these energy tensions run. Let's take a closer look at what's really happening and why it matters. First, here's the basic conflict. The U.S. has long relied on Canada for multiple types of energy: oil, natural gas, hydroelectric power, even nuclear fuel. If you look at the energy map of North America, Canada's massive oil reserves, abundant natural gas fields, hydro resources, and uranium deposits all play a crucial role in powering the U.S. economy. Cheap, steady inflows of these resources have kept American businesses humming. But after Donald Trump's administration slapped tariffs on Canadian goods and took a more protectionist stance, Canada realized it had significant leverage: energy. When Ottawa began signaling it might reduce or disrupt energy exports, Washington definitely took notice. Experts warned that if Canada shuts the valve, some U.S. states could be staring at an energy crisis. And it's no small threat. Canada provides a hefty portion of America's crude oil imports, plus a substantial chunk of natural gas. On top of that, hydropower from places like Quebec and British Columbia is a cheap, eco-friendly power source for many Americans, one that could be cut off if relations really soured. That's why some observers say that the U.S. basically sees Canada as its energy stockpile, while Canada is increasingly telling Washington, "Don't take us for granted." Now, about the 51st state idea, most Canadians roll their eyes at it. Canada is proud of its own national identity, tied to a blend of British and French heritages and shaped by diverse regions like Quebec, which has its own culture and language. For decades, NAFTA and cross-border collaborations made the two countries look almost like one economy. But the recent war of words between Trump and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau shattered the usual friendly vibe. So why is energy at the heart of this spat? Let's break it down. Oil. Canada has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, thanks in part to the vast oil sands in Alberta. Conventional oil reserves also boost its stature in the global energy market. Most of this oil flows to the U.S. through pipelines. Keystone XL became the iconic symbol of Canada-U.S. energy partnership, with both sides clashing about it politically. At one stage, the Trump administration supported moving forward with Keystone XL, authorizing construction. Then, politics intervened, and the project was shelved again. Natural gas. There's a similar story with natural gas. Massive cross-border pipelines supply billions of cubic meters of gas daily from Canada to the U.S. Americans use this affordable fuel for heating homes, generating electricity, and running industries. If Canada ever decided to drastically cut or stop exports, the U.S. wouldn't be able to replace that volume overnight, which could mean skyrocketing prices in several states. Hydropower. The provinces of Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia operate huge hydroelectric plants. For years, northeastern states in the U.S. have happily purchased this clean energy to keep household and industrial electricity bills in check. Because it's both relatively cheap and environmentally friendly, hydropower has gained even more importance in an era focused on cutting carbon emissions. If Canada decided to curb the supply for political reasons, American consumers and green energy goals could pay the price. Nuclear fuel. Canada also stands among the global leaders in uranium mining, especially in Saskatchewan. Many U.S. nuclear power plants depend on Canadian uranium. So while it's technically possible for Canada to halt that supply, it's a dramatic step that neither side would take lightly. Still, it's another bargaining chip in Canada's hand. It's this broad energy interdependence that has led some in Washington to say, let's just make Canada the 51st state so we can control the terms. That kind of remark, whether meant in jest or not, has been tossed around before. Canadian leaders generally laugh it off. But the close integration of the two economies has led some analysts to comment that, on paper, Canada and the US are practically one giant market. Nowadays, though, with Trump's confrontational approach and Canada's willingness to push back, you have to wonder if they're heading for a messy breakup instead of further integration. From the Canadian side, there's a growing sentiment of, we're not anybody's 51st state, and we'll defend our energy interests. That's partly about national pride, but it also reflects hard economic realities. In Alberta, for example, the oil and gas sector is a major money earner. Yet, Trump's tariffs cut into the profit margin for their exports. If the U.S. market squeezes them out, they're forced to consider selling to places like China, but that would require building the needed infrastructure, shipping terminals, LNG facilities, and so on, which doesn't happen overnight. So producers are stuck. We can't lose the U.S. market, but we can't let ourselves be bullied either. In Quebec, the general mood is even more anti-U.S. interference. Quebecers often resent being lumped together with the rest of English-speaking Canada, let alone the United States. So, when there's talk of Canada becoming the 51st state, or of the U.S. dominating Canada's energy trade, many people in Quebec bristle. Still, the provincial economy makes money by selling hydropower to U.S. buyers, which keeps the economic ties alive and well. What happens next? Well, both sides have plenty of reasons not to sever their energy relationship entirely. The U.S. needs cheap, reliable imports, and Canada needs a dependable buyer. But the tone under Trump changed drastically, with tariffs and threats making Ottawa feel cornered. Could future administrations in Washington take a calmer approach? Possibly. Or will Canada diversify its energy exports, forging more deals with overseas buyers in case the U.S. gets too tough? Also possible. Either way, talk of Canada officially becoming part of the U.S. is more joke than reality. Canadians value their autonomy, and their blend of cultures is baked into the national identity. But the fact that these ideas even come up underscores how deeply intertwined these neighbors are, and how powerful the energy card can be when a trade fight blows up. For now, the big takeaway is this. The U.S. and Canada aren't just pals who share the world's longest undefended border. They're also major energy partners with a mutual dependence that runs both ways. If Canada really wanted to flex its muscles, it could tighten the energy taps and create serious repercussions for certain American states. On the flip side, Canada's own producers rely on American markets, so any big shutdown would hit them too. It's a fragile equilibrium. Will the situation lead to a showdown, or can the two countries find a middle ground that keeps energy flowing without constant battles over tariffs and threats? Ultimately, the answer depends on how both governments balance economic needs, national pride, and political pressures. As for becoming the 51st state, that's highly unlikely. Canada's path may be closely connected to the U.S., but it remains firmly its own nation, keen on protecting its resources and identity. The only thing certain is that the next chapter in this energy showdown won't be boring. If you look at the Canadian economy as a whole, it's clear that the United States is Canada's biggest trading partner. Over half of Canada's exports head straight to the American market. A trade war between the two countries, or a serious threat from Canada to cut back on energy exports, could send these numbers tumbling. That kind of move would likely cause the Canadian dollar to swing wildly in value and push up unemployment. Of course, Ottawa wouldn't want to put itself in such a difficult position, yet it's also true that the U.S. would be in trouble if those Canadian energy resources suddenly dried up. In any trade standoff, it's pretty rare to find a true winner. Donald Trump's protectionist policies, which appealed strongly to his voter base, have put Canada on the defensive in several sectors. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, and agriculture, to name a few. Canada's response has been to say, "Don't forget, we have an ace up our sleeve: energy." A report from Integrity Energy warns that if these tensions keep building, North America could face a full-on energy crisis. Fuel costs, power bills, and production expenses might all surge. It wouldn't just damage Canada and the U.S. The global economy could also feel the shockwaves, since a spike in U.S. inflation, or a downturn in its economy tends to rattle international markets and investor confidence. What about the Biden administration? A lot of Canadians initially hoped things would calm down once Trump left office, but the Biden White House doesn't automatically grant Canada a free pass on everything. Some Democrats have issues with Canada's policies. For instance, environmentalists often criticize Alberta's oil sands. So it's possible we'll see friction arising on multiple fronts, even outside the purely economic realm. The phrase, "Is Canada becoming the 51st state?" is obviously exaggerated, but it keeps popping up in debates because it taps into Canadians' frustration over being overshadowed by the U.S. It's like a sarcastic way of saying, hey, the United States acts like it can boss us around. On the flip side, Canadians are quick to reaffirm, we make our own decisions. No way are we letting the U.S. push us into becoming a state. The threat to shut off energy exports basically plays into that same feeling. If you really think we're just an extension of your territory, we'll prove we're not. So, what if Canada really did clamp down on energy shipments? Oil and gas prices in the U.S. would almost certainly climb. States along the northern border might see a sudden spike in heating and electricity costs. Politically, this would cause a huge headache in Washington. Big American industries would lobby hard for the White House to reach an agreement. The agriculture sector, car manufacturers, airlines, trucking firms, everyone would freak out. That would almost force U.S. leaders to come back to the negotiating table. Of course, Canada can't just snap its fingers and pivot all those exports to, say, China or elsewhere. That would require billions of dollars worth of new pipelines, port facilities, or liquefied natural gas terminals. Plus, shipping energy to China comes with its own set of political and economic risks. Still, just having the option out there gives Canada stronger leverage when talks get tense. This 51st state talk is mostly tongue-in-cheek. Some conservative voices in the U.S. half-jokingly say, if Canada's basically our resource department, let's just roll them into our country, while Canadians tend to find that idea insulting. Culturally, Canada has carved out its own identity through universal health care, a more liberal social outlook in many cases, and a French-speaking province in Quebec that's historically been cautious about even English-speaking Canadian influence, let alone American. So the notion of merging with the U.S. sits somewhere between totally unrealistic and downright offensive. Still, jokes aside, Canada gets frustrated when the U.S. imposes tariffs or restrictions under slogans like America First. Canadians see it as a threat to their sovereignty, and whenever that happens, they bring up the energy card, reminding Washington that, you need us too. This cycle repeats. Each country relies on the other, but political clashes turn that reliance into a weapon rather than a benefit. It's not just money on the line, there's also an ideological gap. Canada leans more progressive on social programs and environmental protections, while the Trump-era rhetoric and even some Biden-era policies have clashed with Canada's approach. That tension makes a straightforward trade dispute feel more personal, almost cultural. Experts don't predict a total breakdown anytime soon. There's too much business at stake. Bilateral trade is massive, and both sides profit from it. Still, these public spats show that the existing treaties, like the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, might get revisited. Energy provisions could be renegotiated if Canada really starts flexing its muscle, and the U.S. might respond again with the national security argument to justify protective tariffs. It's a messy situation that could heat up negotiations around supply chains, environmental rules, and resource management. Meanwhile, the 51st state remarks, though they might sound more like political theatrics, hint that some U.S. politicians see Canada as practically their backyard. In Canada, that attitude only fuels the desire to stay independent and possibly ramp up the pushback by threatening an energy blackout. It's about pride, really. Nobody wants to be treated as an afterthought, especially not a G7 country with vast natural resources. If this escalates, the global ramifications could be huge. Oil and gas markets, hydroelectric contracts, nuclear fuel deals, they'd all face turmoil as the two neighbors throw punches. A full-blown trade war could bring economic pain, inflation, and job losses on both sides. Investors might run for the hills, fearing a North American downturn. For now, we can't say for sure if it's all just bluster or if it could turn into something more dire. But the fact that this friction resonates with people in both countries puts pressure on each government to take it seriously. Should negotiations fail, talk of an energy cutoff might shift from mere bluster into an actual policy move. So where does that leave us? Will Canada genuinely use its energy exports as a bargaining chip, or will the U.S. be forced into a more balanced deal? Is that whole 51st state idea just political banter, or does it reveal an uncomfortable level of American influence? One thing is certain. We're at a key turning point for the future of North America's economy and diplomacy. Maybe cooler heads will prevail and strike a compromise, or maybe each side will double down for political gain at home. Either way, we've just seen once again how energy underpins everything, and how Canada, a country loaded with resources, isn't shy about defending its interests. America's vast market depends heavily on that Canadian supply. If Washington pushes too hard, it could spark a severe backlash, forcing everyone back to the table for a fairer agreement. In short, the skirmish over U.S. demands on Canadian resources versus Canada's talk of an energy cutoff shows just how delicate the bond is between these two close neighbors. Yes, they share a massive border and a huge volume of trade, but tariff battles, nationalist rhetoric, and accusations of "you're trying to dominate us" can overshadow decades of friendly cooperation. Where things go from here could reshape not just their economies, but the wider global marketplace. Now we'd love to hear your take. Should Canada truly threaten to turn off the energy tap, or is it better for both nations to find common ground? If these talks fall apart, could we see a major rift in North America's future? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next update. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.